Okay, so welcome to the March Chat online seminar. Just a couple of housekeeping points. At the end of the presentation, or indeed during the presentation, could you please put your questions on chat, the chat facility on Zoom, and after Simon's finished speaking, I will then call people through to ask their question, and you demute yourself before asking. The seminar is also being run live on YouTube, and we're trying to create a channel on YouTube. We need 18 more people to subscribe to go up to the next karma level, or whatever it's called, on YouTube. So if you haven't subscribed, please feel free to do so. 18 more people is all we need. Moment, anyway. So it gives me great pleasure, very particular pleasure actually, to welcome Simon Werrett, who's a colleague of mine at University College London, where he's Professor of History of Science in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. Before coming to UCL, he taught at the Department of History in the University of Washington in Seattle, and he's held visiting fellowships at Max Planck in Berlin, the Science History Institute.
Oh, Frank, you've gone.
Okay, I can't remember where did I get to when I Rob, can you unmute Simon, please?
There we go.
Where did I get?
Science History Institute.
Okay, so he's held fellowships at the Max Planck in Berlin, the Science History Institute in Philadelphia, and the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. Among his publications is a wonderful book called Thrifty Science, which won the Bunge Prize in 2020. And he will be giving the Gerard Turner Memorial Lecture in 2021. That's this year, presumably in October or November, something like that, on that book. He edited a collection of essays on compound histories, and his first book was on fireworks. And for that reason, it is almost impossible to see Simon in November, because he's always being asked to come and give lectures on fireworks at that time of year. Now, slightly unusually, in fact, I think for the first time in this series, Simon's recorded his talk, so he's going to play the recording, and then we will have half an hour or so of question and answer. I say, please do put your questions or indications you want to ask questions in chat. Over to you, Simon.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed, Frank, and thanks for the invitation to speak. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so yes, so it's fabulous to see you all here, and I really appreciate everybody tuning in. It's just great to see you all, so thank you. And as Frank said, what I've done is I recorded the lecture, and I'm going to play it in a moment, and it's about half an hour long, and then when that's over, then we should have time for questions. So I will, without further ado, press the play button and share this with you, and see you in half an hour. And if there's any sort of catastrophes or anything, I won't stop speaking, because obviously it's a recording. So here we go. In a recent issue of Ambix on the future of the history of chemistry, Jenny Rampling proposed that the history of chemistry is a diverse field, but it's defined by its focus on the materiality of substances. And as a result, a more materials-focused history of science should pay more attention to the history of chemistry. And that's something that I certainly agree with. Historians of chemistry have been at the forefront of studies of material culture and materiality, what's now called in the history of science more generally a material turn. And that's taken a number of different directions, many different directions, which I can just briefly discuss. So on the one hand, we have the changing definition and classification of materials at the intersection of diverse forms of experimental and observational techniques, and institutions such as the artisanal, the industrial, and the scientific. And then we have a rejection of sharp demarcations between science and technology, between art and industry. And one thinks, for example, of Ursula Klein and Wolfgang Lefebvre in many publications, but one such as Materials in 18th Century Science, or Ursula Klein's Technoscience in History on Prussia in the 18th and 19th centuries. And generally, we see lots of work looking at the intersections of artisanal and alchemical and philosophical enterprises. So recently, one might think of Elizabeth Berry Drago on the Dutch painter Thomas Fike, or Michael Bycroft and Sven Dupre's work on gems, or Halma Fors on assaying, or Sarah Loengard on painting. There are really interesting methodological innovations around looking at material culture and chemistry. So various projects to restage and reenact chemical practices and instruments from the past, ways to understand processes of production, the relationship between practices and texts. One thinks of recipes in cookery or medicine and art, the work of Pamela Smith or Sven Dupre or Marika Hendrickson, for example. And then using enactment activities to undo apparently secure chemical facts in the work of, say, Hasok Chang, or to make sense of esoteric procedures in Alchemy. One thinks of Larry Principe, Jenny Rampling. And then there are works on locating chemical substances, materials within networks of exchange and experimentation, things like the phosphorus or metals. In Larry Principe's book on the transmutation of chemistry, for example, on Homburg's travels and searches for the secret of the Bologna stone. And there are biographies and studies of the cultural meanings and the changing resonances of different substances. And again, Ursula Klein's work with Emma Sperry would be very indicative of that. There are discussions of hazardous materials and their management and the relationship of materials, chemistry and the environment, things like pollution and poisoning. Studies of acid rain, lead poisoning. There's a wonderful paper we read recently at UCL by Bill Newman on the deadly gaze of the basilisk. There are many other examples. And then finally, just for this very brief sort of run through, there's also the history of instruments and their makers. So Charlotte Abney Solomon recently did a paper in Ambix on the blowpipe. One thinks of Marco Beretta or Lissa Roberts on Lavoisier's instruments and instrument makers. Ursula Klein's work on paper tools, which again has been the subject of a special issue of Ambix recently. So there's really a wealth of activity in this area that's reshaping the landscape of the field. And what I want to do in this talk is simply to tell you about some projects that I've been involved with, which explore material dimensions of science in general, and sometimes with a focus on chemistry, and that's something I'll talk about in the talk. And I should say that they're all works in progress, so they're ongoing, and I very much welcome your thoughts on how to take them forward. So the first project I'd like to tell you about is Compound Histories, which is a book that I edited with Lissa Roberts that came out with Brill in 2018. And it deals with not just material culture, but it sets material culture in chemistry, in relation to questions about governance and about production and the bigger context of the period 1760 to 1840. People in that time, I think, had a similar kind of parallel question to us, which is that they recognized the power of thinking about materials, and they identified them at the center of many enterprises. So, for example, John Playfair, the Edinburgh Professor of Natural Philosophy in 1805, said the following: "Nature," he said, "while she keeps the astronomer and the mechanician at great distance, seems to admit the chemist to a more intimate acquaintance with her secrets. The vast powers which he has acquired over matter, the astonishing transformations which he effects, seem to promise that he shall one day discover the essence of a substance which he has so thoroughly subdued." So chemistry is at the heart of the material and the social realms, in agriculture, in industry, in the arts, in warfare, in political economy, and so on. And that's what we wanted to do in this book, to highlight this point for this period and explore its consequences. So rather than see this time as one dominated by a theoretical revolution, as it's traditionally told, we wanted to consider smaller scale, incremental, but no less consequential transformations in which chemistry and chemical substances were really key. Materials, we wanted to argue, in this time emerged out of and in dialogue with multiple institutions and practices. So, for example, in the book, there's a paper by Lissa Roberts and Joppe van Driel. And van Driel, by the way, did a fantastic PhD in the Netherlands in 2016 called The Filthy and the Fat, about the circulation of waste products in the 18th century in the Netherlands, which I thoroughly recommend. Anyway, in this paper, Roberts and van Driel show that coal wasn't a given in the era of the Industrial Revolution, that's so often taken as the starting point for that revolution. It wasn't a given, but it was rather a material that emerged as a distinctive substance through various commercial and legal conflicts that happened over several decades. So depending on what the lawyers and the attorneys, the scientific experts were trying to argue in efforts to manage the process of extracting coal-like substances from the ground, they gradually determined what the salient properties of this material were, and then it's forged into this substance, coal, that then seems to be self-evident and can be used as an explanatory factor later on for things like the Industrial Revolution. And similarly, in the volume, a wonderful paper by Jose Ramon Bertamo Sanchez shows how the identity and the properties of arsenic were emergent in the process of determining its status in manufactories, in public health projects, in laboratories, law courts in the 1830s and 40s. And again, commercial exploitation, legal clarity are the kinds of things that are motivating the articulation of properties and the identities of substances at this time so that they can be managed effectively. And I think that's one of the lessons of compound histories, and hopefully a useful one. There's a great variety of papers in the book, and I've only really mentioned one element of it. Apologies to everyone who I couldn't talk about, but I do obviously recommend going and having a look, and it's available for free. It's open access. Another thing that we wanted to stress in the book, Compound Histories, was that chemical and material innovation in the period 1760 to 1840 don't always depend on the production of impressive new expensive instruments, the kind that we might associate with people like Lavoisier. And my own contribution to the volume was about household chemistry, the way that people did chemical experimenting in their homes, and they made use of material objects that they had around them, their everyday possessions. And that's a topic that I explored in the second project that I want to talk about briefly. And that's my own research on what I call thrifty science. And I published a book about this in 2019 called Thrifty Science with Chicago. And so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. And what I tried to do in that book is to think about the home in a similar way to the way that historians have thought about the artisanal workshop in recent years, or in recent decades, one maybe should say. So think of the work of someone like Pamela Smith or Paola Bertucci on artisans, and kind of take that to the home as a site of experimentation and engagement with the natural world. There's also been fantastic work on the history of recipes, recipe collections by women, by families in the home, historians of medicine like Elaine Leong, Michelle DeMeo, Sarah Pennell, who've done this work. And that was inspiring to me to kind of to look at the home and think about it as a site of experimental and chemical practice. So I guess what I was interested in this book is thinking about how that story of the history of medicine and women and recipes could be made sense of in relation to some of the characters that we're sort of familiar with from the old scientific revolution story, people like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton. Was there a common framework through which to understand what all of these people are doing? And I believe that the home and the values of domestic life in the 17th and 18th centuries can go a long way to understanding that. So what I looked at was the literature of how to manage a home in that period, how to look after your family, how to order your family, your servants, and also your material possessions, how to look after the house itself, and then repair and work with all the various utensils and furnishings inside it. And what I discerned from looking at this body of literature was a kind of set of values and a set of practices which I think were ultimately motivations to experiment. And they lay behind some of the recipe production and some of the experiments that happened in homes that we're familiar with. So the basic unit that one is working with here is economy with an O. And economy is related but not the same as the term economy with an E. And it basically referred to household management. And it was both a material and a moral enterprise in the sense that works on economy were typically about how to manage your family. They're usually addressed, by the way, to the patriarch, the man of the family. They're about how to manage your family, your children, your wife, your servants, but they're also about the house, the material culture of the home. And I think that's a really interesting combination that we shouldn't take for granted, because it means that people were constantly thinking in terms of the social and the material as a kind of single entity. And there's lots of ways, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, that people are looking at material things as people, if you like, in kind of animate terms, and they're looking at people in objective or objectified terms. So you don't have that sort of strong division of the objective and the subjective in this account. And then one of the values that I am interested in, which came through from reading these works, is the value of thrift. Now, thrift doesn't mean in the 17th, 18th century quite what it means today. So we think of someone who's thrifty as someone who's careful with their money. They'd like to save. They don't want to spend too much. In the early modern period, it's more of a kind of a definition that goes back all the way back to Aristotle, and it's about balance. It's about finding a balance between making use of what you already have and buying or getting new stuff. So every time you go out and buy a new jacket, you should also think about making use of a jacket that you already have. And so what that means is that whilst we have quite good accounts of one side of that equation, the production of new things and the consumption of new things in the 17th and 18th centuries, we don't have such a good sense of the making use part, the do stuff with things you already have. And that term, making use, is actually a kind of term of art, which I think is very interesting. So we tend to think of use and make use as pretty much synonymous. But for early moderns, I would say the make use is a key term, because it emphasizes the fact that you ought to make use of something, come up with a new way of using. And that's the sense in which this is experimental, because what it means is that when you have material possessions, you should think about how to alter them, how to make them endure, how to diversify what you do with them. That's what making use means. And that ultimately is what experimenting is all about. So that's the thing that I see kind of underlying the recipe culture, which is about taking ingredients and mixing them up in different ways, and also experimenting in natural philosophy and in chemistry. So taking materials, learning what you can do with them, how you can put them together, how you can make them perform different things. That's also a process of making use. And it has to be said, and Stephen Shapin pointed this out a long time ago, that most experimenting happens in the home in the early modern period. In the case of chemistry, or chemistry with a Y, and alchemy, that's a bit of an exception, because the use of furnaces meant that you're not going to do that in the home. Nevertheless, there is, the home is a place where a lot of chemical experimentation happens, and I want to kind of see it as part of this domestic culture. Now, because people are thinking about materials as things which need to endure, so you can make use of them as much as possible, and because people are thinking about materials as substances that are going to change their form at different times. So, one week I have a bowl, and the next week it could be turned to a different use, measuring blood for bloodletting, say, and then the following week or month or generation it could be something else. I think people paid more attention to the material of an object than the form of the object. The form was open to revision. And I use the term incomplete objects to describe that. That comes from Karen Noor-Cetina, the sociologist of science. And the basic idea is that things are open-ended. They're revisable, flexible. They are potentially going to have new uses in the future. So what you use them for now is a kind of temporary setup. And I think that's reflected in the way that people turned everyday material artifacts, possessions, household goods into instruments for understanding nature, for doing experiments. And then they turn them back again into the things that they might be used for in other contexts. So, for example, Herman Boerhaave, and this is an English, so most of my Thrifty Science book is about England. We'll talk about other parts of the world shortly, but Herman Boerhaave, whose work Elements of Chemistry is certainly translated into English, circulates in England. He defined an instrument as follows. He says it's that which either has or may be given a certain motion, which being applied to the body to be changed will produce such an alteration in it as the art had before determined. Now that's amazing. That's an amazingly broad definition of an instrument. And it doesn't actually refer to a thing at all. It refers to something that you can do something with. And I think that fits this kind of culture of making use, which goes back to thrift and economy very well. So I think one of the ways that this manifests itself in the material culture of science and chemistry in the 17th and 18th centuries is that you often see setups which involve a mixture of specially designed instruments and everyday household objects. And remember that thrift is about a balance between these two things, between what you have specially made and buy new on the one hand, and making use of what you already have around you at the same time. So you see this in all sorts of experimental setups. Think, for example, of the electrical machine. Now, clearly, an electrical machine is a specialized piece of instrumentation. You'd have to have it made. It's expensive. But what you very often see is that along with the electrical machine, there are lots and lots of everyday household stuff being used for experiments. Straw, silk handkerchiefs, rabbit fur, gun barrels, glass jars, tin foil, that kind of thing. So on the one hand, you've got this making use of things, and in the image you can see here there are at least three instruments. So there's a pipkin, which you would use in the kitchen, a pestle and mortar for grinding up spices and things, and the dog. Poor old dogs get used in a lot of experiments in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then you have this mixture, this combination of old and new. So in the picture below, you can see an early pneumatic trough designed by Stephen Hales. The glass bottle that's collecting the gases, I think, is possibly something that's been created specially for the experiment, but it's situated in a bucket, a wooden bucket, and it's a gun barrel that then passes into the fire of the furnace. So you've got this mixture of special dedicated instruments and everyday household items again. Here's another example, a famous image of Priestley's apparatus for collecting airs. And again, it's a mixture of old and new things. There's a wash basin. He says he gave it back to the person using it for washing stuff after he finished with it. And in the blow up here, you can see a beer glass that has a mouse underneath it. So both readily available items in the household in the 18th century. So it's a mixture of specialized stuff that was made by his glassblower, John Parker, and everyday materials that you would have around you. Here's another image from Priestley where you see this mixture of furnishings, the fireplace and the table, for example, and bladders and candles and everyday things, and also specialized glassware. This is William Brownrigg's pneumatic trough, which is made with a cistern, and you can see wine bottles that he's using to collect the gases. And here's an earlier example. This is from John Mayo, his experiments on respiration. And he's basically using cupping glasses that were used to draw blood as the receivers for controlling air in various experiments, again in a glass trough. And these examples could be multiplied. There's a lot more I could say about thrifty science, particularly about the 19th century and what happens to it, and then the question of whether it's coming back today. Maybe we can talk about that in the questions, but what I want to do to finish off is to just talk about a few more projects that I'm doing in the wake of this work on thrifty science. The first thing is to think about thrift as it developed or as it was articulated in different parts of the world, in different countries. My book is focused on England, and clearly there's going to be a lot more of variety and different ways that people manage their households and how that relates to experiment in different parts of the world. I'm looking at that at the moment in the case of Russia. So in Russia, there's a very interesting book that was produced in manuscript in the 16th century and reproduced a number of times, called the Domostroy, which is, so dom is house and stroy, like perestroika, is building. So how do you manage your house, essentially? And there's a lot of discussions of material culture, of materials, chemical substances in that book, and it's normally read as a social document. It's about relations of husbands and wives and servants and so on. But what I want to do is to really focus in on all the materials that are discussed. And it turns out it's very thrifty, with sort of local variations, of course, of context, but there's a lot that's familiar from the Thrifty Science story that's going on in that Russian story. And I'm also looking later on at Lomonosov, the Russian chemist, professor at the Academy of Sciences in Petersburg in the 18th century. And Lomonosov presents a very interesting case of using chemistry to substitute, to find cheaper and he thinks better materials, in this case for making glass mosaics. So Orthodox religion involves, and domestic arrangements in Russia involve having icons in the house, in the church. And Lomonosov came up with an enterprise to replace the precious stones, the gems that were used to make those traditionally, with coloured glass. And I haven't got time to go into it now, happy to in the questions, but basically Lomonosov argues that Enlightenment and chemistry can kind of regenerate the icon in the 18th century in a way that's going to be good for the government of Russia, for education, for manufacturers, and it's a case of substitution. So substitution is a thrifty technique. Can you use a material to do something that you would normally do with another material? Although Lomonosov works on a much bigger scale, he has a manufactory and a big laboratory in St. Petersburg. It's nevertheless coming out, I would argue, of this thrifty kind of enterprise in Russia. One of the features of Thrifty Science, which I find fascinating, is a question of durability, the durability of materials. There's an imperative to make things last as long as possible in Thrifty Science, because then you can make more use of them. You can turn them to different uses. And that relationship between material things and time is something that I'm exploring also as part of another project that I want to mention, which is called Materials and Time, that's being developed by Marie Thébaud-Sorger, Bernadette Bensaud-Vincent, John Christie, Vivian Kirk, Judith Rainhall, Matt Paskins, and Michael Bycroft, and myself at the present moment. And what we've done is to solicit a series of essays which are by practicing chemists, by chemist historians, and by historians of chemistry, about the temporal aspects of material substances. And this is going to be going into a blog initially, and then the essay, so there'll be a series of essays available online, and then we're going to be developing that into a conference and a book. And I think it's a really exciting project, and there's a great deal of possibility in the topic. So Bernadette Bensaud-Vincent, for example, has done wonderful work on the history of plastic, and talks about the temporality of plastic, I think, in incredibly interesting ways. So, for example, she discusses things like the very, very brief ephemerality of plastic in the present world. Why is it that plastic is used for things like children's party cups and plastic knives and forks? And they have this incredible ephemerality to them that you use them once and they're bright and they're exciting, and they sort of have a moment of glory, and then you throw them away and you're forgotten about forever. So despite the vast quantities of time and energy that go into producing the material plastic, it has this incredibly short, ephemeral, bright burning life, and then of consumption, and then it's discarded. And then, of course, there are big environmental problems around what you do with all that discarded plastic waste. So I think this is a very promising area, and my own contribution to this is about paper. Paper, in a way, is the kind of plastic of the early modern period. And there were lots of interesting kind of crunch points in the early modern period between people who were using paper in a thrifty way. So they would take a letter written by somebody and they would use it to make an envelope to put something in, or to line a pie when they baked it in the oven, things like that. And then there are people like scholars who want to preserve paper because they say that the text written on it is important and it needs to be kept in an archive or a library. You see kind of interesting tensions between these different ways of thinking about material and time in the case of paper and other materials. So by way of conclusion, I just want to mention one more project that I'm involved with, which I'm finding very exciting. There's a forum for the history of chemical sciences, which is a special interest group of the History of Science Society. So it sponsors sessions in the society's meetings every year, and various other activities. And I'm currently involved in a really interesting conversation with the members of that group about where we take the history of chemistry. So it is the case that looking at material culture is breaking down all these boundaries between science and technology and arts and crafts, between the genders and recipes and experiments and so on. Then surely we do need to have a broader repertoire of disciplines and methodologies to understand these things. And then that's led us to be talking about what a chemical humanities might look like on the model of the medical humanities and the health humanities that have emerged as a complement to history of medicine in recent years. So that basically means looking at how you can use studies of law and philosophy and anthropology, the arts, music, theatre, to think about chemistry. Just to take one example, I have a colleague in UCL who's doing wonderful work, Cowrie O'Connor, who's doing wonderful work on the anthropology of the area under the kitchen sink in contemporary households. So there's this kind of fascinating little chemical space underneath the sink where there are all sorts of detergents and bleaches and so on and so forth. How does that work? What does that mean to people, and what's its significance? And I see that, as it happens, as a kind of direct continuation of that Thrifty Science story, because it kind of reverses the situation that instead of going from household practice shaping experiment, you now have experimental science shaping household practice. I mean, that's put it in a crude way, but there's a link between these different cultures. So anthropology there can be enlightening. And I've written about this question in a forthcoming issue of Ambix, which is called Alchemical Knowledge as Social Practice, edited by Megan Piarco, and it's, as I say, something that we're discussing in the forum. And we're actually sponsoring a session on this for the next History of Science Society meeting in New Orleans. Evan Hepler-Smith recently put out a call for papers on asking people, to explore this question of chemical humanities and what it might mean. And we hope that will subsequently turn into, say, an issue of Ambix. So I really encourage you to join us in that conversation, and I'm happy to share the call for papers if anybody wants it. And do take a look at the Ambix issue that Megan has edited, which is going to be coming out soon. And I hope, I've only covered a little tiny slice of the story of material culture, the material turn in history of chemistry, but I hope it's been interesting for you, certainly very exciting for me, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments about these projects and ways to take these kinds of studies forward. So many thanks indeed. So there we go. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. That was really super. Really sort of told us an awful lot about how history of chemistry, indeed history of science generally, has been going over the past few decades. And that's sort of using my usual chair's prerogative leads me on to the sort of question I've got in mind. and that is history of science, perhaps more than most historical subdisciplines, has been prone to these turns. And they don't, as most of them don't last particularly long, but the material turn has lasted quite a long time. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts on why that might be, and whether it will continue as one of the sort of major themes in the subject.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to the fact, the kind of rootedness of much contemporary history of science in the social and kind of laboratory studies that were done in the 70s, beginning in the late 60s, then 70s, and that basic idea that one turns from looking at theory, looking at published papers, to looking at science in action, looking at what people actually do, brings in the question of materiality right from the beginning. So you're dealing with actual practices and actual instruments rather than diagrams in publications. So I think that's sort of at the root of it, and it's gradually been a process of exploring all the ways in which that all the implications of that thought. So one thinks of looking at scientific spaces and architecture and laboratories and so on, and I see the focus on materials is an extension of that. So in the sense that kind of way of thinking about science will remain, then I think the material will continue to be important. And also, I mean, we've only just, I mean, there's such a wealth of knowledge in, for example, in museums of the material culture of science that there's still huge room to kind of explore that more, and have more dialogues around. So I don't think it's going to be going away. I do think it's interesting to think about if you wanted to go back to a much more kind of immaterial aspect of science, where would you go? That's an interesting question, I think, and I'm not sure what the answer to that would be at the moment, but it's certainly something I'm thinking about. If you so one thing another thing I'm working on at the moment is science fiction, and the work of Olaf Stapleton, Liverpool science fiction writer in the 1930s and 40s. And the thing that's remarkable about him is that he wrote novels about the history of humanity over its entire evolutionary existence. So he'll have about 4 or 5 billion years compressed into a couple of hundred pages. So it's as far from that kind of concrete material object on the desktop in front of you type way of thinking as I have found so far. So I'm sort of thinking now about what to do. What can I do with that in relation to the kinds of questions about materials that I've looked at so far.
Yes, right. And I have problems writing about 2 days occasionally. Right, so I've got quite a lot of comments and questions. First comment is from Nicholas Zambuliadis, if I've got that correct. And it's simply a comment that the Meissen painter Horvath was always concerned about thrift in the development of his recipes, which he says was obviously driven by industrial economic considerations. He had to go early, so that's just a comment which you can see in the chat box.
Matt, could I ask what was the name of the painter again, because I didn't see the comment.
Horvath, Hoeroldt.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. There is, I mean, of course, there's a whole discussion to be had about thrifty art, in the sense of how were painters and sculptors and artists thrifty, or were they thrifty, or how did that work? And the only place that I've looked at that in is miniature painting, which was those lovely kind of Elizabethan miniature are often set out as a playing card onto which you then paint your portrait. So so there's kind of stuff to do there, but that's another story.
Marie-Thébaud-Sorger says that the blog on materials and times will soon be available. So that's just for information. And then Vivian Quirk has a question. Vivian. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah.
Hi,
Okay.
Vivian.
Over to you.
Oh, you want me to read my comment?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's just that you said about plastics that they had an ephemeral nature, and it struck me that they were ephemeral as objects rather than as materials, because of course we've heard for quite a while now how they never disappear from the environment as actual materials. They, microplastics endure in the environment and to some extent are, recycled. They're ingested. We find them in fish and so on. So I just wanted to make a comment rather than ask a question about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And this is, of course, the kind of absurdity with plastics, that they're this incredibly enduring material that does last far longer than we might necessarily want them to. But the way that we use plastics is often for the most ephemeral, kind of fleeting moments. And I think Bernadette's point was that plastics have this very kind of modern association with ephemeral fun time. Their disposability and their bright colors and so on are all about this sort of, they all work to encourage this sense that they are just short-term, instant, disposable materials, when in fact the kind of chemical reality of them is very, very different. And I thought that was a very interesting point about temporality in relation to materials. So you're absolutely right, I think, there.
So can I just press you a bit more on this, the distinction that one should make between objects and materials? Because certainly in the case of plastics, that, that's where we see the difference between, ephemeral and everlasting. Is the object's ephemeral, but the material it's made of is everlasting. So you haven't said too much about that distinction between object and material. Can you develop that for us now?
Absolutely. So I think plastic is an interesting case, because it kind of brings back the thrifty, what I see as a kind of distinctive feature of the thrifty culture of materials, which is to say that what I was saying in the talk is that I think early moderns are very sensitive to materials, and they have a sense that the forms of things are liable to change. So if you buy a shirt, there's a good chance that it's going to get cut up and reworked into a different garment, and then it'll be turned into paper, into rags, and then it'll be turned into paper, and so on and so forth. And that there's a strong sense of the material, and the form is more flexible. In the case of plastic, I mean, in theory, it's the same thing. So you have an enduring material, but you can transform it into lots of different forms. However, I suppose with plastic, what you can't reform it. You can once you've turned it into a plastic cup, you can't then melt it down and turn it into something else that easily. It depends on the kind of plastic. And obviously, if you had a material which you could do that with, without any sort of toxic consequences, that might be a good thing today. But I think it's interesting that you have that that sense of materials that foregrounds the material over the form is maybe something that's possibly coming back now.
Carolyn, come on.
I just wondered, Simon, whether you'd had much contact with some of the departments of universities and in economics and business who are dealing with the circular economy. I just think a talk about your book would be of interest to them.
Yeah, I have talked to some economists, one or two lectures a while back, but in Switzerland, I think it was. but no, I mean, it would be great to talk about that, because I think one of the things that, I mean, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but one of the things that I'm hoping the book is useful for is actually thinking about today. So it strikes me that if a question we have is how do we work more sustainably, then the early modern way of thinking about the material world is actually pretty enlightening, because they do they have a different framework for understanding what they're doing, which is really a religious framework as opposed to an environmental one. But then they have recycling and repurposing and reusing, and that's all kind of part of it. But it goes further than that, because of that sense, for example, of incomplete objects, and I think so I think there's actually kind of lessons in that for how we think about being sustainable now. But yeah, the circular economy is definitely a part of that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I've got lots and lots of questions. So let's see if we can see how many we can get through. So the next one is from Alison Manus, who's on YouTube. So I'll need to read this out. She thanks you for your talk. I am very curious about exchange of materials besides paper recipes. Did your Thrifty scientists exchange much of their apparatus? Did they loan or barter? If so, could you speak about the moral valencies of these types of thrift?
Brilliant. So thank you very much. That's a great question. And I actually have a chapter in the book which is partly about Tiberius Cavallo, who was an electrician, a natural philosopher working with electricity in the kind of mid to late 18th century. And Cavallo had a correspondence with James Lind, who was a physician living in Windsor. And what's great about that correspondence, it's in the British Library, is that they're just constantly sending each other stuff. And it's usually bits. It's usually leftovers and broken apparatus and kind of things. So Cavallo says he has he calls it his rubbish box. And he's always saying, oh, I've got a piece of an old quadrant in my rubbish box. Can you do anything with it? Can you make use of it? And then they're constantly exchanging things. So I think this absolutely does go on. And what I do in the book is I think that's part of this thrifty science culture, but it's also part of just the way that people were neighbourly in the 18th century. So there's quite a lot of exchange that happens anyway across the street, so to speak, with people who live around you. And then there are also all kinds of different networks for sharing things. So one thinks of the kind of female networks that Elaine Leong has talked about, sharing medical recipes. There's lots of different ways this happens, and again, I think we tend to focus on the 18th century as this period of the kind of birth of consumerism, and it's about the invention of shopping and going out and buying new stuff. That is clearly happening, but I don't think that precludes a sharing culture. And remember that thrift is about doing both. So I think the 18th century has both the birth of consumerism and also, if anything, an increase in this kind of sharing work. And you see it. I mean, there's endless examples of natural philosophers, experimenters sharing apparatus. Benjamin Franklin is someone who does it a lot, and there's also a huge kind of lots of examples of people complaining when the things that they share never come back to them, or they get broken, or so it's morally valuable to personally, and you know, there are religious imperatives for it. There's also lots of frustrations because it doesn't necessarily work very well, and you know, they have the same kinds of irritations that we do.
Okay, thank you. Lucy Havard next.
Thank you so much for your talk, Simon. Really, really interesting. I was really struck by what you were saying about the sort of the sharing of the domestic in sorts of these experiments and things. And I was just wondering if you thought about sort of taking it a bit further in terms of, and you did mention about makers, but someone who really came to my mind was Josiah Wedgwood, who obviously we kind of think of as associating with pottery and domestic items and things for your dining table and things like that. But he was also a fellow of the Royal Society. He came up with a great pyrometer, which was used in sort of what we would consider scientific experiments and things. And I just wondered whether you thought about that aspect of it, kind of the permeation of the scientific into the domestic and the other way around as well, through a maker.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I haven't looked at Wedgwood actually, and I would like to. He would be a really good person to look at. I suppose the person that I have looked at is James Watt. So Jane Inslee is here, and I have a huge thank Jane enormously, because she helped me to think about James Watt. So one of the wonderful things about Watt is that his workshop is in the Science Museum, so that we have this absolutely brilliant collection of material culture relating to James Watt available to think about. So one of the things you can do is you can, I mean, you know, there's the famous kind of instruments that are associated with Watt, but what's also there in the Science Museum is all the little stuff, the little packets and tied up with string and boxes and things, and there's a lot of ways in which you can see him making use of things to do his work. I mean, I won't go into all of them, but things like there are. If part of my book is about storage, so if you're going to if you're going to make things last, then you need to store them properly. So how you contain the containers for instruments are really important. Things like cupboards and locks and boxes, all really important. And so a lot of the stuff in Watt's workshop is for containing things, and so it's really fascinating to see what he uses. And then of course the other thing with Watt is the separate condenser. So the initial models for the separate condenser, I think they're made with an enema syringe. So you know, he builds you know, and famously he's supposed to come up with these ideas whilst repairing a model of a steam engine. So again, repair is a really important part of this. So these things do figure, but Wedgwood is not someone I've looked at. So I have to go and have a look at him. But thank you very much. That's a great question.
I guess just final comment. I guess there are also lots of parallels then that can also be seen. You're talking about storage of instruments as well, in terms of storage of food and preservation and that kind of thing. So it kind of all links together. But super interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, food storage and food are definitely part of the story. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Megan Piarco. Megan.
Hey, thanks. My question had already pretty much been asked, so I'll defer to another question since we're low on time. But thanks for a great talk, Simon.
Thanks, Megan.
Okay, Boris Jardine.
Hi, sorry, no, I didn't have a question. I just was making a comment that it might be interesting to pair Olaf Stapleton with Timothy Morton. I don't know if you know his work, but it's just that was really just a recommendation for a way of thinking about extremely long timescales. He has a book on what he calls hyper objects, but that's really it.
Well, thank you, Boris. I don't know his work, so I will have a look. I've only done a little tiny bit on Stapleton so far. I just haven't had time yet to kind of really get into it. But that's brilliant.
Now we would normally stop at 6, but Simon, unless you object, we carry on for another 5 or 10 minutes because there's still quite a few questions.
Sure, yeah, happy to.
Yeah. So next one is another YouTube comment from Piarco, who says that Hale's pneumatic trough was intended for washing rather than collecting gases. And then Felix Driver has a question. Felix, where are you?
Thanks, Simon. Can you hear me?
I can. Hello, Felix.
Thank you. It's just a tiny question about the 19th century, but you did say you might say something about what happened to thrifty science in the 19th century. And I'm thinking of a couple of PhD students working with me who are working on aspects of chemistry in relation to plants and medical plants and paper making. And elements of thrifty science seem to recur in the stories they're telling. So what's your picture about what happens to thrifty science?
Thank you. So my argument is, so the last chapter of the book is this kind of very long chapter, which is about the 19th century. And essentially what I argue is that one can see in a lot of ways science being completely reformed in the 19th century in a way that's designed to distinguish it from its thrifty past. So, for example, instead of having using everyday goods, possessions as instruments, turning them into instruments, what you get much more is the purposeful design of scientific instruments that can only be used as scientific instruments. And there are interesting essays from the time of the Great Exhibition, which basically argue that a scientific instrument can only be something that's been designed by an expert professional instrument maker and can only be used for scientific inquiry. And then you get a proliferation of specialized, dedicated instruments and spaces for science. So experiment leaves the household and it moves into the laboratory. Or into a separate laboratory. There's still plenty of crossovers between these two.
I think so.
Yeah,
but
it's still the case. I mean, I think of something like Gießen and the kind of all-male laboratory training up technicians. That's not the kind of thrifty family enterprise that I think one might see earlier. So I would say a lot of values start to appear which are kind of opposite to thrift. We should, this is the roots of big science. I think big science goes back to kind of 1800 thereabouts, because that's when people start to value having specialized instrumentation and budgets. The more money you can spend on your science, the better, rather than the less, and it starts to become something that's very distinctive. Now, a crucial thing to say is that thrifty science doesn't disappear, because I think another thing that happens is that there's as with so many things, history, time, temporalities added into the mix, so that thrifty science becomes a stage in the development of science, and it becomes the starting point. So it takes on this character of being immature. It's the stuff that you get children to do at home in the kitchen. That's how you learn about science. It's the stuff that amateurs and non-Europeans do when they do science. It's these kinds of thrifty things. But those then become, if given enough time and cultivation, proper science. They become professional science. So these thrifty activities are all still going on, but they're demoted, if you like, from being the kind of normal science to being a beginning stage of a more mature form of science. So I think that's kind of what's happening, and obviously that's linked into all kinds of changes in society and industry, and it's part of that. But I think so. economic science. And then one more thing that happens is that people start to think of thrift much more in terms of efficiency, in terms of saving. So thrift goes from this question of balance to being a question of doing things in the most efficient way possible to save money, which you can reinvest into an enterprise or use in some other way. So it's also a change in the way that people think about thrift, and that again goes with financial capital concerns, and accountancy comes together with thrift, so that the ideal is that you do an enterprise in which the amounts, the quantities of stuff used generate profit or outcomes that have some kind of quantitative progress over what you put in, and that doesn't happen in the earlier period. So keeping accounts in the home is certainly a part of thrifty household management, but there's no sense in which, when you're doing something thrifty, you're thinking about it in those kinds of quantitative accountancy terms. So I think it becomes a kind of expert discourse that then natural philosophers will seek to take over in the 19th century. And you see that in people like Charles Babbage doing the account. There's an amazing passage, and sorry I'm going on about this, but there's an amazing passage in Charles Babbage's works on political economy, where he says, I'm going to give you an account of how much all the bits of a dead horse are worth. And it turns out that you can make a profit from selling all the bits of a dead horse. And that idea that you basically turn this use of this dead horse into these commodities that all have a kind of profit, and then you figure out the efficiency of the system. That's something that's sort of indicative of 19th century natural philosophical approaches to this issue. But you wouldn't see anything like that in the earlier period, despite the fact that I'm sure people used dead horses for all kinds of things for centuries before 1800.
Okay, Bruce, some example. But I think two more questions, and then we'll draw to a conclusion. The first one is from John Christie, again on YouTube, so I'll need to read it out. Does chemistry's history project radically different materialities in the long term? Think of 16th century Paracelsian principle, 19th century synthetics, contemporary nano-forged materials.
So hi John, thank you for your question. I think that's a very good question. I don't have an answer to that. I think one would have to. That's a big question to think about. So I couldn't offer a decent answer right now. So I won't. But I'll think about it.
Right. And then finally from Carmen Schmeckel, who's asked me to read this out because he's got background noise where he's located. He says one of the main challenges to the preservation of materials was decay, and related to it, even the danger of disease from fomius, in inverted commas, remained seeds of disease lingering for reminder seeds of disease lingering, for example, in cloth. Were there specific methods or recipes for preserving materials from decay? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, apart from there's a huge wealth of ways of preserving food, and I mean, there's good histories of the crossover between questions about preservation in cookery and preservation in things like anatomy. So there's that, and then of course there's lots of ways of looking after materials in your home. So polishing wood, waxing floors, dusting, all these kinds of things. And again, it comes back to containers. If you put things into into cupboards and then conserve them. My favorite ones is on shelves, bookshelves would have a little curtain that ran along the top, so that, and the theory was that as you pull the book out from the shelf, the curtain will brush the dust off the top of the book as it comes out. And I'm not entirely sure how effective that would be, but apparently that was quite a thing on 17th century shelves. So there's all these, there's this huge, I mean, it's a big fight. Owning a home is a fight to keep it going and to preserve all the stuff in it and stop it from falling down. So there's a lot of that. I mean, fire as well. There's a fire is an enormous risk, and obviously for alchemists and chemists that's an issue as well. One of the things that is intriguing, and this is another part of the book, which is it's kind of telling the history of science through the history of household architecture. If you go back far enough, then houses start to be made of materials where it's probably going to burn down. So we keep the house really simple and the materials really simple, because we could just build another one if it does. It's kind of interesting to think about how do people understand materials and what you could do with them in that sort of situation. Going backwards to the Middle Ages is something I think would be really interesting to do in this story. Anyway, that's so yeah. I recommend reading books on household management, because you'll see there's lots of discussions of these techniques.
And Michael Joyce has just crept one in under the line. In the 1820s, Ampere had a professional instrument maker make equipment for working on electromagnetism, but others felt this was extravagant. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mike. One of the things, I mean, I didn't talk about it, but it's in that last chapter of the book, is that around 1800 there is a big debate, and particularly among chemists, about the necessity of having any specialized equipment or space for doing chemistry. So it's not that obvious to people that this is progress. One of the kind of criticisms that I get from scientists is that the move from thrifty science to sort of professional 19th century science must have been inevitable. People have just done all the research you could do in the home, and there wasn't anything else to be done, so they had to have more specialized equipment and spaces and so on. But I think there's two kind of responses to that. One is that if we follow Hassock's wonderful work, then it's not a done deal. There's much more to be learned from going back to things that look apparently closed. And the other thing is that if you actually look at the people people discussing this at the time, there was a debate, and people said, we can learn a lot of things using simple apparatus. It's not by any means finished yet. So if people are promoting more specialized instrumentation and space, then there's that's potentially suspect, and there might be other reasons for doing that. So that criticism of Ampere makes sense to me, because I think in that time there was a discussion about that, and it wasn't obvious that there was one way forward only, and that was the path to more specialization.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I think we'll sort of draw a line to that now. Just sort of one or two housekeeping things. The next seminar on this series will be on the 22nd of April at 5 p.m. British summertime by then, and apologies for my mucking up the North American time with European time for this seminar. And Alan Rock will then be talking about Meyer, Mendeleev and parallel paths to periodicities, late 1860s, early 1870s. We're not going to have a seminar in May, but instead, we heard about Josiah Wedgwood earlier, but instead we're going to have a meeting spread over 2 afternoons to mark the 250th anniversary of the birth of his son, Tom Wedgwood, which we're holding jointly with the Royal Photographic Society, because Wedgwood to some extent is seen rightly as one of the founders of Technology, and that's going to be on the afternoons of the 14th and 15th of May, and we'll be sending out details of that probably in a couple of weeks' time or so. And the seminar after that will be on the 7th of June, when Robert Budd will be talking. So it remains only for me to thank the production team, and there's quite a different production team to pull these seminars together. That's sort of Rob Johnson, Becky Martin, Carolyn Cobbold, Joe Hedison, Chris Campbell, and Anna Simmons, without which we would not be able to have such a reasonably smooth seminar series. And so finally, just to thank Simon for a really wonderful talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. And thanks, Rob. Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Anna. And great to see you all. Great to see you all. Stay well.
Have a good evening, afternoon, wherever you happen to be.